My name is Jennifer Sanborn, and I work with the American Baptist Home Mission Societies. We're located in King of Prussia, Pennsylvania, but I happen to live in Connecticut, and I'm a child of New York, but more on that in a moment. I always like to begin my day with gratitude, and so how appropriate that we can gather and share in some words of thanksgiving. First and foremost, to God. It's January in Syracuse. We could travel safely. I put my coat in the car. I thought I don't even need it. The conditions were made such that we could gather, and soon those online will join us as well. I want to also express my gratitude to you all. Part of our mission at ABHMS is equipping leaders. If leaders don't show up online and in person, there's no one to equip. So your presence here, like Jim said, is something I really want to affirm, celebrate, and give thanks for. I want to thank Jim and all the staff of ABC NYS. They're running here, there, and everywhere, wearing more hats than they probably thought they would today, and isn't that the life of ministry? So thanks to all of them. I want to thank our hosts here at First Baptist. We are going to warm this room up ourselves, and I want to thank our hosts online as well, who are greeting people there. This is the new era in which we live and serve, this hybrid reality. And then I want to thank Jake Mulder from the Fuller Youth Institute, who convened a really powerful group of speakers who I think are going to share relevant information. They're going to stir our hearts, they're going to awaken our minds, and I think we're going to return not with the franchisable 1, 2, 3 ABC, but with the most critical questions to be asking as we work with youth today. And now, thanks is due to someone who isn't with us today. Chris Rausch, who is Executive Director of the American Baptist Foundation, was my colleague at ABHMS when she connected with Jake, and Jake challenged a group convened to think, how would you carry this to your local setting, to your context? Chris worked really closely with New York churches because of her own history in the state, and approached Jim and said, hey, do you think if we put out an opportunity for folks who care about youth, could we get a crowd? And look at you, you're here. So indeed, her instincts were wise and right. And I want to just say a word about Chris. I shared that I am a child of New York. I was born in Bainbridge. Sometimes New York is so big we have to do a little contextualizing. So I was born in Bainbridge. My dad was pastor there at that time. I also lived in Franklin, Meredith, Sherburne, went to grad school at SU, so I feel like I'm back in my old haunts. So I have connections with folks in this room. In all of those places, a local church fostered young Jennifer. There were adults who cared about me. There were people that I saw and gathered with weekly who wanted to check in, who were glad that I was there. While the local church was the weekly lifeblood of my faith existence, it was Pathfinder. It was camp that really awakened my sense of a personal relationship with Jesus and a compelling desire to follow in his way. Well, some of you who are connecting all these dots might know that Chris Rausch was then director of Pathfinder. Well, my family had moved to Massachusetts. My parents drove, we lived on Martha's Vineyard, so on an island. They committed to take a ferry, drive 7 or so hours for 1 week of camp, because it was the place where my sister and I had found our greatest faith connections. Year after year, we returned. And Chris said, you know, I've seen these Sanborn sisters around a bunch. I wonder if they'd like to be on staff. So then I spent a couple of summers working on staff. Fast forward, I'm married to Chris's brother. She is my sister-in-law. It's a small world, right? All these American Baptist connections as they get formed. Already I saw my old friend Lisa's mom, and I said, I was at your house one summer when I was on staff. Our desire is that other young Jennifers of this day would find adults who similarly say, hey, I've seen you hanging around, or I haven't seen you hanging around. How can I draw you in? And keep presenting compelling opportunities. I would not be serving the denomination that I grew up in if not for people along the way who tapped me on the shoulder and said, we see something in you. We want you to be part of the life of the church we are building. So thank you, thank you, thank you to each of you for all the ways that you do that over and over every day. I think Jim is coming back up.
We're back on schedule. I'd like to open us with prayer, and then we'll have a brief word from Mr. Decker, who works for the 10 by 10 collaboration in the Syracuse area. And then the next person you hear will be Jake Mulder. On the back of your sheet, you have our speakers for the day, Jake Mulder, Frank Reynoso, and Kelly Hyatt, and they can tell you more about what they do and who they are as they make their presentation. So let's pray. Our God, you have entrusted to us ministry. You have set before us opportunities. You bring into our lives people who need to hear the good news of new life in Jesus Christ, people who need to find love and forgiveness and acceptance and mercy. In so many ways, you present us opportunities to participate in the kingdom of God. We pray that this day, through our fellowship with one another and through these speakers, that you would open our eyes, that you would quicken our hearts, that you would enlighten our minds in all the ways that we can bring the good news to those who are around us, in particular to the young people, to people whose lives are quite different from our lives, the way our lives were when we were their age, who are a very different place in their lives than we are. Give us insight into who they are, their joys and their sorrows. Help us most of all to be listening people who communicate through who we are, the kind of God that you are. We ask these things in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
It is so good to be with you. My name is Jake Mulder. I am part of the Fuller Youth Institute at Fuller Theological Seminary, so that's my context. I am here today as part of the 10 by 10 collaboration, which is a national coalition, a national collaboration of organizations who are focused on youth discipleship and asking questions about what do teenagers, what do children, what do young adults today need to be formed in the faith. And that is really the question that brings us together today. So whether you're here in person, if you're tuned in online, if you're watching this recording at a later date, it's just so good to be with you and to focus on this conversation. I will say, if you have access to a handout, there's one that says 10 by 10 on the front. I will cover some of the details of this handout along the way. Our function for each of these presentations, and you'll get to hear from me, then you're going to get to hear from Kelly in just a little bit, and then from Frank after that. We'll take a little while to share our information, kind of give the presentation. We're not going to take questions along the way at that point. What we will do, so that this ends up being a nice recording for later, is when we're done giving the presentation, we'll stop at that point, and for those of you in the room, you can go ahead and ask questions. So just so that we don't have hands raised along the way that we're ignoring, wanted to let you know we're going to take questions at the end. So by way of getting into this conversation and thinking about what is it that young people need most when it comes to discipling them and forming them in the faith, I'm going to start with a point that hopefully all of us can agree on, and that is this. We believe that the good news of Jesus is the hope and salvation for this generation. Can I get an amen to that one? All right, I know we've got some Baptists, but also some other traditions and backgrounds, so we'll keep it flexible in terms of the call and response. What I want to say here is young people have a lot of information coming at them every day. They have a lot of sources that they can turn to. They have a lot of influences in their life. And for those of us who are asking questions about youth ministry and asking what do young people need today, what we find is it becomes very easy to focus on what's changing and what's new. How do I keep up with this social media source or that social media source, or this could be anything, right? Influence in a teenager's life. While we do need to stay relevant, what we would say is as or more important than anything else is staying focused on the reality that what was true 2,000 years ago, young people need to be guided and invited into the life and way of Jesus, is absolutely what today's young people need, is to be invited and guided into the life of Jesus. Now, I come from a research organization at Fuller. We conduct academic research, but then we translate it into practical resources. I do want to give you a bit of the lay of the land of what's happening when we look at the discipleship or faith formation of young people in the United States. So I'm going to put a few statistics and information in front of you here. This is a conservative estimate. So there's a lot of research that's done on this. This is on the conservative side. What the research reveals is that about half of those who graduate from youth group end up drifting from God and drifting from church after they get out of high school. Okay, now I said conservative estimate because some estimates show it's about 40 to 50%. If you start to look at some of the realistic numbers, that easily gets into about 60 or 70% of today's young people. And I'm not just talking about those who are marginally involved in the church or maybe go once a year at Christmas. This is looking at those young people who grow up in Sunday school, were active in youth group. What we see is about half of those after high school end up drifting away from the faith, end up drifting away from the church. And I know that for those in the room and online, this is a Saturday morning, so this is kind of like, wait, you're throwing statistics and bad news at me. We are going to go into some of the hopeful possibility, but we really want to make sure that we're starting with reality and what is actually happening. So this statistic cuts across denominations, cuts across regions of the country. For a vast majority of our young people, the way we're inviting them into the faith is not helping them carry that faith into adulthood. Another reality that I want to put in front of you is, especially in light of the pandemic, we really see a lot of youth leaders are struggling across the country. Now, part of that is due to the fact that many of our churches and ministries are not investing the same set of resources in ministry with young people as they used to. We're seeing that part-time or full-time positions of youth leaders are often being cut or are decreasing. But what we increasingly hear from youth leaders is that those things that they did 5 years ago or 10 years ago or 20 years ago, depending on how long they've been in youth ministry, just don't seem to be working the same way that they were in a previous generation. A couple more statistics I want to put up in front of you. There was some research done by the Springtide Institute. Okay, so it was done by Springtide during the pandemic, and they were looking at young people's faith formation during the pandemic. And what they discovered in that research is only 10% of 13 to 25-year-olds heard from a religious leader during the first year of the pandemic. I'm going to say that one more time. Only 10% of teenagers and young adults ended up hearing from a religious figure during the pandemic. Now, I want to put that in conversation with this next statistic. In that same research, they were asking young people, well, how important are relationships to you? And what those same young people said, 70% of them said that they have a newfound appreciation for relationships and connection, and they don't plan to take that for granted in the way that they used to. Here's the principle. Teenagers, as they always have been, are highly influenced by relationship and community and those people that they know care about them. During the pandemic, which is one of those times where young people needed investment and connection and relationship most, only 1 in 10 said that they actually heard from a religious figure, that they were in touch with someone who was in a church. So you start to put those things together, what young people need most and the way that we're often doing ministry with them don't always connect. Now, the net effect of this, okay, the net effect of that drifting that's taking place, there's some research done by the Pine Tops Foundation, and what they found is, despite how hard many of us are working, the reality is in the United States, we are seeing 1 million young people drift from the faith and drift from the church every single year. Now, I hope that statistic makes you say, wow, or it kind of catches you. But that is the reality when we look at the number who are drifting every single year. That number has now hit 1 million young people in the United States every year are drifting from the faith. All right, that's going to be the end of my bad news presentation for this morning. If the coffee didn't wake you up, hopefully some of the statistics do. I do want to turn to some good news, and here is the good news. in the midst of those bare spots, and we certainly do see some bare spots, we see some challenges, we see some struggles taking place as we try and form the faith of the next generation. But in the midst of that, we see some incredible bright spots taking place. We see incredible signs of hope and possibility where the Holy Spirit is still active, where Jesus still transforms lives, and where God continues to build God's church. There is a disproportionate amount of the time that when we see these bright spots, when we see what's working with young people, it tends to go back to this phrase. And this phrase does show up on your handout, so you can either write it down or if you want to find it there. But the phrase is this: we find what works with young people is relational discipleship radically focused on Jesus. Relational discipleship radically focused on Jesus. Now, forming the faith of young people is a complex topic. It is not easy. I spent several years as a youth pastor, and I'm still here and there active in youth ministry. For those of you who have raised teenagers, interacted with young people, you know it is anything but a simple and easy ride. If I'm going to give you the simplest version, right? If you just need something simple to hold on to, what should youth ministry look like in your church or your ministry? This is the phrase that we would put behind it. It needs to be relational discipleship that's radically focused on Jesus. I'll break that phrase apart real quick. It's relational because there's actually a human connection that is happening. It needs to be a person connected to that young person. Now, certainly we need to surround young people with peers and friends. What we would say ultimately, this has to be a caring Christian adult. It could be mom or dad, it could be grandpa or grandma, it could be some other caregiver, it can be adult volunteer from the church, a lot of caring Christian adults, but it's about that relationship and it is ultimately about that connection. I can point you to that from the research. I can point you to that because if we were to go around this room and say, okay, when you think about why you are where you are in your faith and what made the biggest differences, I spend a lot of time doing that. 8, 9 times out of 10, what people point to is it is a person who embodied the faith for them. It is a person who invests in them. That's the relationship. Discipleship. It is a relationship that does have a specific purpose. It's not just relationship for relationship's sake. It is a relationship that is meant to form that young person's faith, that's meant to shape them as a disciple of Jesus. That's the second part. This third part, though, it's radically focused on Jesus. What we hear from a lot of young people who grow up in churches or have experiences with ministry, they say, yeah, I did the whole Christian thing or I did the whole church thing, but they'll say it felt like it was about a lot of things. It didn't actually feel like it was about Jesus. You know, my church spent time talking about politics or talking about this or talking about that, but it feels like Jesus got buried in there somewhere. So again, relationship, focused on discipleship, but it's got to be radically focused on Jesus. It has to be introducing young people to who Jesus is and what Jesus invites them into. Now, I'm going to tell you a little bit more about what this looks like, but what I would much rather do is show you an example of what relational discipleship radically focused on Jesus looks like. So I'm going to play a short video. The video is about 3 minutes. I mentioned that at Fuller we do research, and in our research, we spent some time studying about 250 churches in the United States that are thriving in their ministry with young people. And one of the churches that we studied is called Fellowship Memphis. At the point that we studied them a few years ago, they were just doing some really, really incredible ministry. And in particular, we met 2 young women, Natalie and Jazzy. And they told us, Jazzy is the older one, Natalie's the younger one. And they told us about just kind of what their journey has looked like. So I want to show you this video as an example of what relational discipleship radically focused on Jesus might look like.
Discipleship was not a word that I heard growing up. No one said, oh, I disciple so-and-so. We just kind of did it. The Lord was pushing me to step out and essentially started learning the message of discipleship. Kind of felt like a burning bush experience where the Lord was like, it's time to start passing that on. So the next question is like, oh, well, great, to who?
My family had come to fellowship when I was in the 7th grade, and they put me in a youth group. And I didn't like youth group because I'm an old church. I was the only black kid in my youth group. I didn't want to feel singled out. I had the worst attitude. I didn't want to be there.
We were all in this tiny room, 4 middle school, high school girls, and I barely know any of them. I thought, all right, there could be a divine appointment in this room. So I'm just going to keep praying, and I'm going to wait. I'm going to let God speak. And kid you not, there was one in the room who was like, not having anything artificial.
And she sat beside me, and I was like, who is this woman? Like, why is she here? Like, she's 20-something, and she keeps talking to us and wants to be like our Sunday school teacher, but it's not even Sunday school. But she like had this gentle like persistence about her that I didn't notice.
That night, I just started dreaming of this young girl. Sometimes we were going on walks, sometimes we were going on runs, sometimes we were sitting around at a table, and I thought, okay, I'm gonna ask her to coffee because 13-year-olds like coffee.
I was 13, 14, didn't drink coffee. I was like, I mean, I guess. I have nothing else to do. Are you gonna pick me up?
I knew it was an obedient move. I want to have it all together, but Lord, I don't know what's next. I'm sitting at coffee with a 13-year-old. I don't know what to say. He's like, just pursue an honest conversation. Just talk to her.
I remember she asked me a question about like someone's relationship in the youth group. I think they're gonna break up. And usually if I talk to an adult like that about another adult, the adult would say like, well, you don't know anything, like you're just a little girl, or like that's rude, how do you know? But she didn't say that to me. She kind of had a conversation with me about what I had just said, and it wasn't a conversation of like correction, it was just a conversation between a person and a person. I mean, when you're 13 and you're in school and you have parents and everyone's older than you and telling you what to do, but then this one person comes into your life and like, here's what you say. Like, I'm really emotional, but that like melted my heart. And I think that gave like she could have said anything to me after that and I would have heard her. So, I mean, she calls me her sister and we're sisters.
People are not projects. We started sitting down and meeting. We were for sure gonna see each other on Sundays, but all of a sudden, a project didn't emerge. There wasn't this point where I go, okay, I'm discipling you and you're my disciple. It expanded what I really think that God meant for discipleship to be. This has been the one thing where I feel that I've been blessed in every way. She's a gift, she's a little sister. It's just meant the world to me.
See people as people. Don't come with all the answers and all the help, but have a conversation with someone and taking things slow and looking at people as if they're royalty, because they are. Treat people like people, like they're your friend, and actually mean it in your heart.
I love that phrase that Jazzy says about partway through the video where she says, people are not projects, right? People are not projects, or maybe we could put in there, people are not programs, people are not just a group. And part of the reason that a video like that resonates, or why we think that this phrase of relational discipleship radically focused on Jesus is so important, is often when we've asked, well, what do young people need most? Our knee-jerk response has been, they need youth group, right? And well, what does youth group mean? Oftentimes youth group means we're gonna put them over there, and over there is just somewhere separate from where the adults are. Maybe we have some old couches or some fun activities. We have just enough chaperones to kind of pass the legal limit, but we kind of pass young people through this experience as a group, but oftentimes what we end up missing is that relationship, and it is that connection. So there were so many aspects of what Natalie and Jazzy talked about in that conversation of when you look at what shaped Natalie, the younger one, It was someone who saw her, someone who took notice and interest in her, and someone who was willing to respond to her and journey with her. And what we're really betting on, what we're investing in, is the idea that if we can recenter our ministry with young people around this concept, relational discipleship radically focused on Jesus, that is positioned to have a transformative effect on what ministry looks like with young people in our country. Some of the good news that I want to continue to share is that focus of relational discipleship radically focused on Jesus. It's not something that just one or two churches are zeroing in on. We've spent the last couple of years building some energy around this, and it is now part of something called the 10 by 10 collaboration. Now, if you're in this room or watching the video and you're saying, I've never heard of the 10 by 10 collaboration, that's just fine, and that's most likely the way that it should be, because this whole thing has not gone fully public yet. We've been building the behind-the-scenes work, and it's a collaboration between about 60 national organizations who are asking questions about how do we need to work together to be more effective in our work with young people. The 10 by 10 collaboration is planning to go public in fall of 2023. So the hope is that in 2023 or getting into 2024, you might hear more about it. The mission of 10 by 10 is to make faith matter more for 10 million young people in the next 10 years in the spirit of John 10:10. If you're paying attention this morning, you've hopefully seen the number 10 show up a few times, right? So 10 by 10, 10 million teenagers over the next 10 years. If we're seeing 1 million per year who are drifting from the faith, we would actually like to see that turned around. If every year we can be forming the faith of 1 million, then over the next 10 years, that's 10 million. But notice we've even got some scripture in there. John 10:10, the 10 theme continues. When you ask, well, okay, is this a Baptist thing, or is this a Methodist thing, or is this a non-denominational thing, is this a suburban thing or an urban thing, we would like to say it's a Jesus thing. And we found pretty much everybody can agree on John 10, verse 10. Well, what does John 10, verse 10 invite us into? Jesus says, I have come that they may have life and may have it to the full. Or I have come that they may have life and to have it abundantly. I have 2 kids, an 8-year-old and a 5-year-old. I want them to experience that full and abundant life that Jesus invites them into. I would imagine for those of you as well, you would like to see the young people that you know, whether it's your own kids or nieces or nephews or grandchildren or somebody that you've had in Sunday school or a neighbor, you want to see them experience that full and abundant life that Jesus invites them into as well. So the way that we're thinking about this and what we're hoping and praying for is that, first of all ministry is local. So when we say relational discipleship radically focused on Jesus, it does require ministry to be taking place on the ground and in connection. And that's why I don't care if you're part of a massive church or you're part of a tiny church or you're part of a big ministry or a small ministry. We need everybody leaning into this direction of relational discipleship radically focused on Jesus. The way that we're going to get to that happening with 10 million people is the more of us who are doing that in more parts of the country, we are hopeful can just bring a groundswell of momentum that will look like, and got a little map of the U.S. up on here. If we've got a few people over here and a few people over here and a few people over there, and this is kind of like raindrops, right? There's a little bit happening here, a little bit happening here, but then there's some other denominations and churches and ministries doing something over here, and then something happening over here, and then something over here, and then something happening over here. We would hope that the testimony of teenagers who are growing up 5 years from now, 15 years from now, will not primarily be, well, yeah, the church or faith didn't connect with me because, but their testimony would be, man, this person from my church walked with me. And when I went through the hard stuff or the good stuff or whatever it was, or when I was pushing people away, there were these adults who loved me, who invested in me, who surrounded me. I am still walking with Jesus today because of those people who invested in my life when there's no reason they should have. They should have let me go a long time ago, but they kept walking with me. Again, it's that strategy of relational discipleship, radically focused on Jesus, is what we think teenagers in today's young people need. Now, for those of you who would say, well, it can't be just that simple. If you're a teacher, right, and you need curriculum and things to program around, I will say, okay, there's a little more depth than that. So I don't want to lose the simplicity of relational discipleship radically focused on Jesus. But for those who would say, okay, but what else do I need to be thinking about? I'm going to offer a little more of the what else. So when we think about discipleship, we think there are 7 areas of discipleship that need to be emphasized most. So for those of you who you oversee the youth ministry, or you supervise someone who oversees the youth ministry, or you think about curriculum and teaching, here are the 7 areas of discipleship that we think matter most. The way that we came up with these is earlier in the work of the 10 by 10 collaboration, we had about 25 ministry organizations, diverse ministry organizations representing several parachurch organizations, many different denominations, but we spent time asking this question: what do all of us hold in common? Okay, in all of our strategies, whether you're Youth for Christ or Young Life or Fellowship of Christian Athletes, whether you're Methodist or Episcopalian or Baptist or non-denominational, when we think about discipling young people, what are the things that each of us hold in common and really think matters most? There are 7 areas that we think matter most. These are not on the handout, so I would invite you to you can take a photo of these, write these down if they're helpful. If you're more a simplicity person, feel free to just turn your brain off for a minute. We'll move on from the 7 things and back to one thing in just a second. I don't want you to lose relational discipleship radically focused on Jesus. But if you want to move a little bit deeper of, okay, what does that consist of? We think these 7 can serve as a bit of a compass. They can orient you to the direction that you might need to go next. So here are those 7 discipleship emphases. The first one says grow spiritually. We think that those who lead ministry with young people in churches or in ministries need to be growing themselves. And we think that for too long, the way that youth work has looked is it's often about pouring out, pouring out, pouring out. I mean, a lot of ministry is frequently pouring out, pouring out, pouring out. We think that leaders in the church, leaders in the ministry, need to be taking their own growth and development seriously. The second, we think those who work with young people need to be trained to lead change. Okay, those who work with young people need training on how to lead change, because often we find that those who work with young people are navigating this adapting, changing world over here, but then they're in systems or churches or ministries that don't seem to change very fast. And oftentimes we find youth workers burning out because they can't navigate those two worlds. So we think those who work with young people need training on how to lead change in their ministry setting. Third thing is that youth leaders need to be skilled in how to train mentors, in how to train caring Christian adults. We think too often people who get into youth ministry get into it for very good reason, because they want to make a difference in the life of a kid, right? They want to make a difference in the life of a kid, and that is a high calling, and that is important work. But if we end up with a youth leader, and if we're honest, I think some of our churches have reinforced this idea where we bring in a youth worker to do ministry with the teenagers. But the reality is that often what that youth worker needs to do is be equipping and training other adults in the church or ministry with how to do that work. So that's the third part. If you're thinking, I wish there were more resources and training on these topics, that's part of what we're building out, the 10 by 10 website and all that, so more of those resources are coming and are available. We also think most ministry organizations or denominations offer training on these topics. If you start looking for these topics, you can find them through the American Baptist Church or others. We're just trying to present this organizing framework. The fourth thing that this requires is the ability to equip diverse families, okay, to equip diverse families. What the research continues to reveal is that whole idea of relational discipleship radically focused on Jesus. Well, who is the primary relationship who has the most possibility for spiritual influence on the life of a child? It is that young person's mom and or dad, if mom and or dad are in the picture, or grandpa or grandma, or whoever functions as the primary caregiver for that young person. That is the person that is often the primary spiritual influence in the life of a young person. like it or not, if you are the person in your child's life who's able to carry that out. So we think youth leaders need to be trained on how to equip diverse families. And then the last three, identity, belonging, and purpose, are all around what is the way that a young person needs to experience the faith. Okay, so for a teenager experiencing Jesus, we think that it is wonderful if they've decided to accept Jesus into their heart, or they've given their life to Jesus, or whatever is the language that you use for that. We often find that using that language can be a little too simplistic in terms of how we form the faith of young people. So we would offer identity, belonging, and purpose, and here's what that means. Young people need to find their identity in Jesus. Viewing themselves as a follower of Jesus and what Jesus invites them into needs to shape the way that they think about themselves, the way that they see their identity. So that's identity. We need to nurture young people's sense of belonging. So when young people ask questions about where do I fit, or who are my people, or who do I belong with, that the Christian faith needs to actually invite them into, you know who you fit with, you know who's there for you. It is your church family, or it is this body of Christians who will come alongside of you and invest in you. But then the last piece is that faith needs to give young people a sense of purpose. It actually needs to answer some of their questions of, well, why am I here and what am I supposed to do with my life? As they start to navigate decisions about career or investment in the world, that a life of following Jesus should be a life that invites them into the highest calling of how they can invest and pour out for others. So again, this is a little more of the complexity, right? If you need the simplicity, let's go back to relational discipleship, radically focused on Jesus. But for those of you who are saying, well, I need to program around this, or I need to train people around this, there you go. 7 discipleship emphases that help kind of boil down and give more detail on what relational discipleship radically focused on Jesus looks like. For those of you who are saying, okay, well, Jake, you said you come from a research background. I don't know if I trust the research as much. I just want to know, what did Jesus say and what did Jesus do? Well, let's go ahead and go that direction. I have the answer as well as the question on the slide, but if you were to ask the question, what was Jesus's approach to ministry? How did Jesus carry out discipleship? Jesus had 3 words that were pretty simple. And again, they're on the screen. Come, follow me. When Jesus approached people, when Jesus approached his disciples, the invitation was quite simple. It was to come and follow him. It was to walk with him. It was to learn from him. It was a highly relational form of ministry. So, yes, what you're hearing is in the year 2023 from a research organization who's pulled 60 other organizations together, the rocket science of what young people need is as cutting edge as 2,000 years ago, right? The invitation that Jesus made to come follow me and walk with me and I will walk with you is exactly what young people need today. If you're not sure about it, and I heard somebody who's a pastor today say, I haven't really been keyed into what's happening with young people or had a training on that in about 20 years. Okay, so if you've been a little out of touch of what's happening with young people, I would invite you to go to someone who's worked with young people for 10 or 15 or 25 years and ask them, what do you think young people need most? I would say 9 times out of 10, that person is going to say they need adults who are investing in them, who care about them, who love them, who show them the way of Jesus. There are other things that they need, and that has a lot of complexity to it, but that continues to be the foundation and the bedrock of what's happening. Now, Frank and Kelly are here from Young Life and from Fellowship of Christian Athletes, so I'll let them challenge that or play with that if they want, but I think you're going to hear a pretty consistent message of what young people need most. So if you're asking those questions, what do the next steps look like in our church or our ministry? The beauty of this is it can take a lot of different forms. There is no magic formula or the exact program to implement, but the core building block is back to this idea of relational discipleship, radically focused on Jesus. To wrap up, what I want to do is just give you a couple of stories, couple of examples. One of those takes place in a very big church. One of those takes place in a very small church. And I just want to give you a little bit of what we're seeing these days around this idea of radical relational discipleship, radically focused on Jesus. So the first leader that I want to introduce you to, a youth leader named Aaron Kohler. Aaron has been the primary youth leader at a very large church in Chicago. Now, right before the pandemic, Aaron was going through some of our training, and we were talking about the need to get in touch with young people and understand who they are. And so shortly before the pandemic hit, Aaron and his leaders at a very big church, some volunteers, ended up spending some time asking young people, what is it that you need most? What are you going through? What do you hope to have from our church? Well, then in March of 2020, right, I think I have those dates right, the pandemic hit. And if your church was like most, all kind of in-person ministry shuts down. And at least for those of us who are in youth ministry, a lot of that youth ministry went online to Zoom. And we were trying to run Zoom youth group. And this is exactly what Aaron and his church did. They have a beautiful facility, and they run traditionally a very large show. And that show is some games to start out, and then after the games, they go into a message, and then after the message, they sing some songs and then go into the message. And if there's time at the end of all that, they do just a few minutes of small groups, right? That's the way that they used to do it, which for those who run a youth group is fairly traditional. Aaron would say, if we were honest, 95 to 98% of our time and attention went to running the show. It went to planning the games, it went to figuring out what the songs were going to be, figuring out what the message was going to be. Most of the time was spent as a large group together, and young people kind of came to the program. He said very little of our effort actually went into the small groups at the end. But he said, we value relationships, so we wanted to make sure we had small groups. What ended up happening when the pandemic hit and they went online is attendance, and maybe some of you saw this in kind of Zoom youth group, started here and then very quickly went like this. And they just had attendance drop off almost immediately and saw a significant decline in their ministry. Well, out of the listening that they had done, what they ended up doing was thinking, okay, well, maybe there is something to this whole focus on relationship. The key was in their church, they actually had to get permission to move to relationship and away from the program, because they're a programmatically driven church. What their church is really good at is doing the big gathering. They got permission to pivot and put more of a focus on relationship. So what they ended up doing was spending a lot more time in smaller groups and smaller circles. Now the key here was that for Aaron and others who lead the youth ministry in their church, they stopped putting all of their time into preparing the message and preparing the songs and preparing the games. They started to spend their time training adults to invest in the lives of kids. Training adults on how do you actually have a conversation with a teenager? What are the questions that young people are asking? How do we make sure we're pursuing church safety and all the things that we need to pursue? So they revolutionized their approach to how they were going about ministry. They stopped the big show, and here's what ended up happening. Within a few weeks of moving to that form of ministry, now keep in mind, they're a bigger church, so they had about 100 teenagers engaging in their ministry to start. After just a few weeks of moving to this small group, relationally focused model during the pandemic, they saw attendance increase to about 400 teenagers who were engaging in their ministry. The reason for that is the teenagers started to bring their friends, and some of this did take place over Zoom, but the key was it wasn't just engaging in something that they were watching. It wasn't just watching something that was happening, it was actually engaging in life, reality, and conversation. The other part is because this was taking place in very small groups, in many cases they were able to actually meet in person, but because it was 4 people or 6 people, it wasn't against some of the restrictions that were happening during COVID, they could carry out this form of ministry. And again, they saw their ministry increase from about 100 teenagers engaging to 400 teenagers who are engaging. Now that's the example from a bigger church. I want to give you an example of a smaller church. I would ask you to raise hands, but there's never any hands raised when I ask this question. And the question is, does anybody vacation in Volga, South Dakota? And for the most part, the answer to that is no. We worked with a church in Volga, South Dakota called Volga Christian Reformed Church. They were part of our research a number of years ago. Volga is a community, at the time at least, of about 2,000 people. This was a church of about 80, 90 people at the time that we worked with them. Here's a photo of their church building, and it's just a standard, kind of modest church building. This is what it looks like on the inside, at least at the time that we visited. So not revolutionary or cutting edge in terms of their decor or anything else that's going on. And this was a church that was really positioned to grow old. The average age in the congregation was somewhere between 65 and 70 years old. There were a very small handful of young people in the church, very small handful. And one of the people who saw this was Vanda Bjorklund. So Vanda was the youth leader in the church. She was not a paid youth leader. She was a volunteer youth leader. She was a public school teacher by day, but really had a passion for young people in the church, so she spent her time investing in them. Vanda, because she cared about the younger generation, she saw that they were disengaged. She saw that they didn't really seem welcomed into what was happening in the overall life of the church. And Vanda thought, well, I want to see that change. I don't want the teenagers to have that experience. Vanda was never formally trained in youth ministry, as far as I'm aware. She just loved young people, and she followed her instincts and listening to those young people for what is it exactly that they need. She decided to start a ministry in their church called Bridge Sundays. And Bridge Sundays were any Sunday that was the 5th Sunday of the month. They would go in the church basement, they would have a church potluck, and they would spend time hearing from the teenagers about what was happening in the lives of the teenagers. Now, I got to experience this potluck, and it comes with all the Midwest casseroles and salads and things that tend to come at a church potluck. But it was just one small step for Vanda where she was trying to help adults and teenagers in the church get to know each other. Vanda had a set of friends, and she thought it'd be fun if the teenagers could get to know Vanda's friends. In particular, Vanda had a 90-year-old friend named Trudy, and Trudy liked to golf. And so Vanda thought, well, we'll go ahead and take the teenagers golfing with Trudy and me, and this will be a good time. On the first few holes, the teenagers were thinking that this was kind of lame until they got to hole 5 or 6, and Trudy had a 30-foot putt to make, and the teenagers were thinking, it'll be impressive if she can make this in like 3 hits. She's 90 years old. And Trudy sunk the 30-foot putt, and the teenagers kind of went nuts on the golf course. And after this, they thought, okay, Trudy's pretty cool. Maybe we'll get to know her a little bit more. Vanda had some other things that she decided to focus on. One was they thought originally that the church would be the best place to host a youth group, because that's just what you're supposed to do. You meet in the church and have a youth group. And Vanda thought, well, if the teenagers meet in the church for youth group and there's no other adults there, how are we ever going to help the teenagers get to know the adults? And she thought, so let's stop meeting in the church. And she asked if adults in the church, particularly the senior adults, would be willing to host, and keep in mind, the youth group is like 4 kids at this point, right? So it's not a huge ask. But she asked if adults in the church, particularly senior adults, would be willing to host the youth ministry and the youth group gathering in their homes. And it was as simple as they asked the senior adults to prepare a meal, and Vanda was there, so it's not like the senior adults had to run the ministry, but the senior adults would prepare a meal. They would spend time eating the food together and having some conversation. The senior adults could then do whatever they wanted to do, but the youth group would meet somewhere in the home for Bible study, prayer, reflection. But relationships started to form over time. Vanda took very seriously her investment in the teenagers, and she did not believe some of the lies that young people don't want to have depth or don't want to follow Jesus. She challenged them with the gospel and invited them and trained them in what that looks like. And everything came to a head. There was a prayer meeting that took place at the church about a year later. It was an evening prayer meeting. And Vonda had been having conversations with the pastor along the way and helping the pastor understand kind of what was happening with the teenagers. So she had told the pastor, hey, for this prayer meeting, when the prayer requests come up, what I want you to do is actually invite each of the teenagers in the church to pray for one of those prayer requests. And so the prayer meeting started the way that a lot of prayer meetings do, where there's some prayer requests that happen, and many of them were coming from the older generation in the church. And after each one, the pastor would say, to a different teenager, hey, would you be willing to pray for that one? Would you be willing to pray for that one? And so when the prayer time began, the adults in the church were kind of thinking, all right, I guess we're going to spend some time in like the shallow end of prayer, right? Because the teenagers are going to pray like a help them, bless them, whatever. Well, what the adults weren't prepared for is, as a result of Vonda's work and the work of the church, the teenagers started to pray these deep, fervent, passionate prayers. And we had ended up visiting this church several years after this had happened, but everybody in the church remembered that moment where it was like their eyes were open to the depth and investment and faith of the teenagers in that church. And they just said at that moment, we started to see the teenagers in a completely different light. We didn't see them as a separate group that just wanted their, time over there and play video games or whatever it is. We actually saw them as part of our overall church community. And what ended up happening is the teenagers knew, they're now in their 20s or some of them are older. And when we went and talked to those teenagers learning more about this church, they looked back at that prayer gathering as a moment of change where they knew that they mattered and they were actually accepted in the life of the overall church. And so what ended up happening is when we visited, these teenagers were saying things like, and keep in mind, this is a church where the average age is 65, 70, very young group, where the teenagers are saying things like, I feel like I have 10 sets of grandparents in this church. One of the teenagers said this, walking through the doors on Sunday morning is the best, right? A teenager who loves walking through the doors of the church on Sunday morning, not just for the worship service, but because of the set of relationships. There was one young person who we talked to who ended up getting very involved in the church choir, right? And was surrounded by adults. And this teenager who's now a little bit older doesn't live in the same community, but frequently comes back to the community and attends church. And we said, oh, is it just that the worship is so great? And, she said, did you see our church? No, it's not awesome. Like, we don't do those things very well. But she said, I go to see the adults and the senior adults and the people who have invested in me because I know they care about me and they want to know what's happening in my life. It's those experiences, and I'll pull it back to relational discipleship, radically focused on Jesus. It's those experiences that we think can change the trajectory of what's happening with the faith of a younger generation. It's those things that matter most when you talk to young people who have grown up and ask, what was really transformative? Or if you ask them the flip side, what didn't you like about the church? What frustrated you about the Christian faith? And often you'll hear from young people, they don't understand me. They don't listen to me. They're just trying to get me to fit into a box, as opposed to if that story and narrative is, hey, these people love me so much. They journeyed with me even when I made mistakes, even when I didn't get it right, even when I told them whatever it is, they were still there. They still love me. They still journeyed with me. Those tend to be the transformative stories that we hear. Last comment, for those of you who are asking, where do I start? The challenge and opportunity of relational discipleship radically focused on Jesus, there's no manual. You can't just buy the curriculum. You can't look at what the big church up the street is doing and just roll that program out in your church. Relational discipleship radically focused on Jesus really needs to respond to who are those unique young people in your church, what is happening in their life, and how do you respond to it? I have a colleague, he's a professor at Fuller Seminary in church leadership, Scott Cormode, and he says this, leadership begins with listening. Leadership begins with listening. And I think there's really something to that statement when we think about relational discipleship, radically focused on Jesus. If you find yourself saying, well, I'd really love to invest in a young person in that way, I'd love to get ministry like this started in our church, where do we start? I would encourage you to start by listening to and connecting with those young people in your church. Not with an agenda. Don't just say, hey, we're calling you into the church board meeting. You need to design the new youth group. But spend some time in a more casual setting, clearly showing them, we love you, care about you, we want to invest in you. Can you tell us more? Tell me more. What's happening in your life? What are the good parts? What are the hard parts? If you get blown off that first time, try it again a few weeks later, right? Show that continual investment. We've heard from some young people in churches who really do push that away because they're kind of shocked when it happens for the first time, because they're like, the adults in our church haven't noticed that we're here for as long as I can remember, and now all of a sudden they want to pay attention. Is this a trick? Is this a gimmick? Right? And I think Kelly and Frank are going to talk about some of those details of what does it actually look like to invest in a way that you get that sort of response, even when there's resistance up front. So I'll finish with, we're pretty excited about this relational discipleship, radically focused on Jesus. It's new, it's cutting edge, it's research-based, and it's, again, as new as 2,000 years ago when Jesus walked the earth with a group of people and said, let's do this in relationship. It's still the thing that's most transformative in youth ministry, and we think has potential to change the church and our world in all sorts of positive ways. So thanks for listening. That's all I have to share on relational discipleship, radically focused on Jesus. I think if we wrap up the recording, and we will move into about 5 or 10 minutes of questions.
Hi, Jake. Thank you. You talked a lot about that. It seemed like there was that linchpin in that Volga church when they had that moment when there was just that big experience and that buy-in. I'd like to learn a little bit more about some of those strategies for gently convincing our senior generation that it's really worth it, and that shifting our strategies to something that doesn't maybe suit the needs that we have today, but suits the needs of tomorrow in a way that doesn't seem combative or pushing aside where we've come from to look to where we're going.
If you start going around your church, hey, we're going to focus on the young people now, that's not good news for everybody, right? That is often met with resistance. A couple of pieces that I would offer, knowing this is unique in every context and culture and way of doing it, would be, I told that story the way that I did because it's easy to only focus on the prayer gathering that happened, and I think this is somehow the way we tell these stories, as like the mountaintop experience where everything changed, and to not recognize all of the work that went into that point. If you were to talk to Vonda, it was a year or 2 years of pushing, of resistance, of conversations, and really tilling the soil to get ready for the point of that prayer meeting. Vonda didn't know it was going to go the way at that prayer meeting. And I'll just say, maybe by way of encouragement, we work with and talk to a lot of churches and ministries who will tell us it feels like at times it is a year or 2 years or 5 years of kind of pushing before something really breaks loose. So I just want to encourage those of you who are leaning in to keep leaning in, and sometimes that takes time. The second thing that I'll say is there's a voice, an author on change, who says people don't resist change, they resist loss. Okay, people don't resist change, they resist loss. We have found that true in many, many churches where people are resisting work with young people or don't feel like it's worth it. And the reason is they're not resisting the change, but they're resisting a sense of loss. A lot of older people, especially in churches, when they hear we're going to focus on young people, and there's a new pastor or youth leader or campaign or something that's come in, usually what that translates into is everything that matters to us is not going to matter anymore. Everything that we care about will be taken away from us, and the teenagers are the reason it's being taken away from us. And so that sort of it's us or them mentality is one that we need to figure out how to move past. The the best way that we have found to move past it, and this is exactly what Vonda did, is through relationship, okay? Is through relationship. And so I'll be very plain this way. If you're thinking about changing the worship style in your church from something the older generation likes to something that the younger generation will like, and you just announce, hey, for the sake of the teenagers, we're going to do this, 9.9 times out of 10, that's going to go poorly for you. There are churches that we've seen do that well, and there was one particular church that I visited where they had a very sort of contemporary style of worship, and there was an older woman in the church, and some younger people near her, and after the service, I just said, hey, no judgment, or I don't want to put you in a box, but like, I wouldn't picture that this is the type of worship that you enjoy. And she said, oh, it is not. I would rather have hymns and robes. And she said, but you know what I love more than that? I love that my granddaughter wants to worship with me. And I care about my granddaughter, and I tried the other way, and I saw my granddaughter disengaged. If worshiping with my granddaughter means we sing these songs, I can do that, right? And so one other maybe example, has anybody seen the movie Up, like Pixar, right? The one with the older guy and the younger kid. To me, that's part of the model for change in our churches around these things, is you start with two generations that are just completely disconnected. This is where it comes back to relationship. In our churches, if we can actually help people get connected relationally and understanding each other, often the changes will flow from there. So there's a whole lot more complexity, but that'd just be maybe a place to get started.
We're a little tiny church, and my kids, part of the reason that they are still going to church as adults is because we had a foster grandparent program, and we said every adult is assigned a kid, and they're supposed to pray for that kid, on a regular basis. And our foster grandparents, one of them was very old and feeble, and so my kid visited her in the nursing home eventually, stuff like that. But they didn't lose anything. They gained a kid, and the kid gained a grandparent, and they had some other adult they could talk to in the church, and that was really helpful.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. And I'll just make the comment, because I tried to share some examples of, very small churches, big churches, medium churches. If you're a very small church, I actually think you have an advantage here. Because if you're saying we've got 2 teenagers and 35 people in our church, well, hey, you've got an 18-to-1 ratio. Try and figure out who's going to be investing in that teenager and how. You got to find not awkward ways to do it, and it'll take, especially if you haven't done this, it can take some awkwardness. But boy, if the testimony of that kid when they're 18 or 20 is, I was too loved, I was too supported, I was listened to too much, too many people sent me letters when I went to college and asked, what better problem to have? Very rarely is that the complaint that you hear from teenagers who grow up in churches. One very quick story on that, and then we'll take your question. I was working with this was a small church, and I was doing an interview with her in front of her congregation, and she was about 17 years old, and I asked her the question, hey, if you were to bring a friend to your church, how many adults in the church would you feel comfortable introducing your friend to? And she said, pretty much every adult. This church loves me, they care about me. And I had told her I was going to ask her this question in advance, and she had agreed, so I wasn't catching her by surprise on the second question. I said, okay, great. Let's say you had something really hard going on in your life, or let's say your friend had something really hard going on. After the service was done, how many adults, and this was a church of maybe 60 people, I said, how many of the adults in the church would you feel comfortable going to and being completely honest and sharing with them? And she paused, and tears started to well up in her eyes. And she said, maybe 1. And you could just feel the collective heartbreak in the church, because this girl had grown up in the church, and they're thinking, we've known her since she was in diapers. There are a lot of adults around her, not a lot of adults that she would feel comfortable actually going to, right? That's the difference that we're talking about here.
So I was just curious, as a pastor, if you had any advice as far as what my role would be as lead pastor, but also, too, if a church were to have a heart for youth in their community, and we don't really have that yet, what are some best ways to kind of dive into kind of cultivating that? So it's kind of two parts.
You know, if you were to say, we don't have any young people in our church, right? Like, where do we start? There are great places that you can start. If you would say, we've got a lot of 80-year-olds at our church, but that's it. What do we do now? Great. There's a place that you can start. Yeah, your question was about the role of a pastor. I think I want to say, number one, we don't think pastors have to do it all. So there's often pressure that for a pastor, this is one more thing to add to your list. But the flip side of that we would say is, I think often the message to pastors has been, you're too old to do youth ministry, find a cool 20-something-year-old to do it. And we would also push against that. We would say, as the pastor, as other adults in the church, you have a critical role to play to keep the investment consistent and to make sure that it's happening. I was one of those 19, 20-year-old youth pastors, and as long as kids weren't getting drunk or pregnant, we could do pretty much whatever we wanted, right? Like, as long as we stayed in our area, didn't break too much, and that's a dangerous model. You know, I thought I was pretty mature as a 19, 20-year-old. I was not, as we all weren't. In hindsight, I wish there was someone who was walking with me a little bit more, helping me sort out what that looks like. So the short answer that I think I would say is just, I think you as the pastor have the ability to create the sort of environment and set the sort of trajectory that's needed. Whoever is the person or small group working with young people in your church, providing them the direction and support that they need. And maybe here's the last thing to say. What's required to help young people follow Jesus is adults who are following Jesus. And so the more you as the pastor are forming the faith and investing in adults who turn around and say, so how do I pour that back in? You're absolutely doing what you need to do.